Welcome, everyone. We will get started with this webinar now. Hi, I'm Tim Whitehouse, Executive Director of Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER. We have over 1,000 registrants for this webinar. Thank you for being here. Before we introduce today's panelists and agenda, I want to let you know a little bit about PEER and what we do. PEER specializes in whistleblower protections, First Amendment rights, and civil service laws for government employees that work on environmental, public health, and natural resource issues. We also work with current and former government employees, usually anonymously, to address issues through official channels and to bring hidden information into the light of day. As we close in on the first 100 days of the Trump administration, it is clear that this administration poses grave threats to the rule of law, our country's civil service, and the environment. This webinar is part of our effort to help educate the public about how this crisis is affecting our nation's ability to address climate change and to urge everyone to take action. Again, we appreciate your interest and in support for the issues discussed today. Before we get started, we're going to do an audience poll. We are interested in who is attending this webinar. The poll will stay up for about 30 seconds. We would like to know how you describe yourself. So Mur, tell us about today's webinar and the speakers and the results of our poll.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mur Meitzelfeld, PEER's Institutional Giving Manager, and I will be co-moderating today's event with Tim. This webinar is presented as part of Bard College's Worldwide Climate and Justice Education Week. Our speakers today will be Dr. Kyla Bennett, PEER's Science Policy Director, Monica Medina, and Dr. David Cash. So let's take a look at the results of our audience poll to see who's joining us today. All right, looks like we have a few current government employees, some terminated, some media, some students, so a good mix of attendees, nonprofits, and looks like we have a couple private sector, lots of concerned citizens, wonderful, and also a lot of retired attendees today. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Can we go to the next slide, please, with the speakers? Dr. Kyla Bennett previously worked at EPA and first became involved with PEER in the mid-1990s when she became a whistleblower herself. Kyla has a PhD in ecology from the University of Connecticut and a law degree from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. Her familiarity with science, the law, and the inner workings of state and federal agencies enable her to assist public environmental employees throughout New England. Monica Medina is an Arnhold Distinguished Fellow at Conservation International. Ms. Medina has had an extensive career in environmental law, policy, philanthropy, media, and advocacy. From 2009 to 2012, she served as the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere at NOAA. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Monica attended Georgetown University on an Army ROTC scholarship and began her legal career on active duty in the honors program of the Army General Counsel's Office. Dr. David Cash served as the regional administrator for EPA's New England office during the Biden administration. As regional administrator, Dr. Cash oversaw the largest investment in climate justice in the region and a realignment of priorities to better connect with communities. Dr. Cash holds a PhD in public policy from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, a science teaching degree from Lewis and Clark in Portland, Oregon, and a BS in biology from Yale University. Next slide. For today's agenda, Kyla will discuss the reality of climate change and climate policy under Trump and Doge. Then Monica will describe ongoing cuts at NOAA and the National Weather Service and what this means for weather forecasting. David will talk to us about how the constitutional crisis we are facing is also impacting the climate crisis and EPA. If time permits, we will have a short Q&A between each presentation. We will end with a panel discussion on what actions our viewers can take to support climate action and public employees, and then have an open Q&A at the end. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and click the thumbs up to upvote questions you are particularly interested in. And we will be monitoring questions through the Q&A, not the chat. Okay, and with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kyla Bennett. Next slide, take it away, Kyla.
Thanks so much, Mur, and thank you all for being here. So today I'm going to talk about 4 things. First, I'm going to talk about the status of climate change science. Where are we now? Second, I'm going to talk about why we as a human species are unable to get a handle on climate change. Third, I'm going to talk about some of the strides that were made under previous administrations. And finally, I'm going to talk about what's going on now under the Trump administration. Next slide, please. The first thing, let's talk about the status of climate change science right now. This is a chart from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And you'll notice I put a red star there from March 7th, 2025. This is the first time in recorded human history that we exceeded 430 parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Now, Mauna Loa Observatory has been collecting these carbon dioxide levels since 1958. Of course, we can look at carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere from ice cores, so we can go back millions of years, basically. I was born when there were 316 parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So you can see how drastically it has risen over the past decades. Next slide, please. So basically, atmospheric carbon dioxide is higher now than at any time in the past several 100,000 years of human history. But it's not just the levels that are of concern. We have to look at the speed of the change. So while you keep in mind that carbon dioxide levels have been lower than 400 parts per million for the past 23 million years. So what I want you to remember is humans have never been alive before when we've had this much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. But it's the speed of change which is so concerning. In other words, it's 100 times faster than it was before the Industrial Revolution. And why is this important? It's important because at this rate of change, adaptation of species, not just other animals, but also human animals, becomes difficult, if not impossible. Next slide, please. So why is it that we as humans, that we cannot get a handle on climate change? My personal belief, and that of many other scientists, is that it's because climate change is not the problem to be fixed. Climate change is a symptom of a much bigger problem, which we call ecological overreach or overshoot. And on the right here, you can see a little graph I have that Earth Overshoot Day. This is done every single year. Basically, the resources that we have on planet Earth are finite. It's only a certain amount of resources that we have. And we are consuming more than 1.7 Earth's worth of resources every year. And this is getting bigger and bigger as our population grows. So the problem isn't climate change, the problem is ecological overreach. And in order to address this, we need to change the way we live. So something else I want you to keep in mind is that although Monica and David and I are going to be talking about how climate change is a problem and how NOAA and EPA are at risk and what's going on under the Trump administration, it's not just NOAA and EPA, and it's not just climate change. The problem is all of these other planetary boundaries that we are exceeding: pollution, lack of water, lack of clean water, changes in land use, things like that. So it's a lot to handle, and it's a polycrisis, not just climate change crisis. Next slide, please. So what happened under previous administrations? Well, the Biden administration was one of the first to really take it seriously. And I honestly recently had a reporter ask me when EPA and the environment had its heyday. And when I thought about it, it was really under President Nixon, which is completely scary to me that that was our heyday. The Biden administration did take some strides. They set targets to cut emissions by at least 50% by 2030. But again, that's a target. It wasn't something that happened. They did pass a major climate smart stimulus package after the pandemic. They tackled some of the super pollutants. But you can see from this chart that a lot of things, a lot of their goals were not accomplished. Next slide, please. And so even though President Biden talked a good talk and he seemed to want to do the right thing, oil and gas production in the US surged to record highs under the Biden administration. And again, keep in mind that even if we were to stop burning fossil fuels tonight at midnight, if something happened and we just stopped, we would still be in trouble because of all of these other things. But if we don't stop burning fossil fuels, if we don't stop putting carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, we're in deep trouble. Next slide, please. And that brings us to where we are today. Climate change in the era of Trump and Doge. And it is not looking promising. Next slide, please. The overarching goals of the Trump administration and of Elon Musk's Doge are basically 5 different categories. Unrestrained executive power. If you notice that President Trump has issued hundreds of executive orders, something that he criticized the Biden administration for doing, but illegal executive orders, trying to bring control under the executive branch away from the legislative branch and away from the judicial branch. Privatization. Elon Musk seems to want to privatize everything, the National Weather Service, Social Security, Medicare, everything. And that's a problem as well, because the federal government is basically a service organization. The federal government was not meant to make money. The federal government is not a business. The federal government serves the American people, and it should not be privatized. They also want to dismantle civil service, and we're going to get into that in the next slide, but you can see it happening, and some of you on this talk today are fired federal employees, illegally terminated. So they are trying to dismantle the entire federal government. Fourth is the largest data breach in human history. For those of you who have been paying attention to the news, you may have seen the whistleblower from the National Labor Relations Board who has come forward and said that Doge got all of this data, which is incredibly concerning and may have indeed gone to Russia, or at least Russia tried to get in when the Doge did download these data. And finally, hostility to all federal regulation, especially environmental regulations. And one of the executive orders that Trump did, that he signed, said that for every new regulation that EPA comes up with, they have to get rid of 10, which is crazy because there's a reason for each and every one of these regulations. Next slide, please. So they're eating the checks and they're eating the balances. They're not eating the dogs and cats in Springfield, but they are getting rid of our guardrails. This administration and Doge are attacking civil service. They have put thousands of employees on administrative leave, taken them out of their jobs. They're doing mass firings. They've gotten rid of our environmental justice and DEI people. They're planning major reductions in force. They're also attacking all of the oversight bodies that protect the federal service, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Office of Special Counsel, the Inspectors General. I don't know if you recall, but very beginning of Trump's administration, he fired 17 inspector generals. These are the watchdogs that are supposed to be, and who do, they're independent and they look for waste, fraud, and abuse. They were doing the job that Elon Musk is allegedly doing now, and they were doing a very good job. Also, the unions. They have attacked the unions, trying to get rid of them altogether for federal employees. The other problem is that our judicial system is not equipped to address this level of illegality. It's like drinking out of a fire hose. All of the lawsuits, all of the things that are happening, it's just insane. And not only are they not equipped to address this level of illegality, we have a Supreme Court of the United States that is very deferential to Trump and executive power. There was that very rare 9-0 decision on the Garcia case, the man who is in El Salvadorian prison for no reason. But Trump seems to be ignoring that SCOTUS decision. So we really have lost many of our guardrails, and we are all waiting with bated breath to see what the Supreme Court does with this particular case and what they're going to be doing with all of these other cases that reach them. Next slide, please. So what are these people saying? Lee Zeldin, the administrator of EPA, said spending money on climate change is, quote, inexcusable, unjustifiable, and illegitimate. Crazy stuff coming out of him. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, he's talking about Doge here. They've cracked the code. They're inside the belly of the beast of the bureaucracy. The federal government is not a beast. It is truly not a beast. Again, it is a service to the American people, to everybody who lives in this country. And as an example, one example is that there are 36 scientists at EPA headquarters, 36, who stand between the entire chemical industry and 340 million Americans. That is it. That is not a beast. These people are on the front line fighting to save all of us. Trump says it costs much more to do things environmentally clean. Whatever that means, I think we can kind of figure out what he was trying to say there. And Musk said, the risk is not as high as a lot of people say it is with respect to global warming. But I think if you just keep increasing the parts per million in the atmosphere long enough, eventually it actually simply gets uncomfortable to breathe. No, Elon, that's not all that's not going to happen. Yes, we are going to have difficulty breathing, but we're also going to have difficulty living. Next slide, please. So what is the forecast? The problem is that what Trump is doing at the federal level is trickling down to states and municipalities. He has directed the Department of Justice to block all burdensome and ideologically motivated climate change or energy policies that threaten American energy dominance and our economic and national security. So where the federal government goes, so goes the state and local governments. So we can ill afford to lose the next 3.5 years or even longer to not acting on climate change. Inaction is not an option. There will be a point of no return, and many scientists think that this point of no return will be in the early 2030s because of things like feedback loops. For example, when there's warmer air, it can hold more water, and that actually traps more heat. So that's a positive feedback loop that makes it warmer and warmer. There's a website called climateclock.world, which says that we have, as of today, it said we had 4 years and 95 days to turn this around. Otherwise, humans will go extinct. Now, Trump will be president, maybe, for another 3.5 years, and that frightens me. So that's my talk, and I'm happy to talk later about some hopeful things that we can look forward to.
Thank you, Kyla. We'll move on to the next speaker in the interest of time.
Let me just start by saying hello to everyone and thank you to all the federal servants and former federal servants who are on this call. It is a really difficult time for everyone, both the people who've worked so hard in the federal government, particularly I'm thinking of my former colleagues at NOAA, but throughout the federal government, and for those of us on the outside now, whether in nonprofits or in the private sector, there are many ripple effects to what the Trump administration is doing to NOAA, and I'll talk about those now. Let me just take a minute to say I was the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of NOAA during the Obama administration, and most recently, I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans, Environment, and Science, where I worked hand in hand with Special Presidential Envoy Kerry on climate change, and I worked with folks on my team who represented us in the global weather forecasting architecture. We are in the US part of an even bigger system in which we are able to have even better weather forecasts because of our cooperation, and that too is very much at risk. Next slide. So NOAA has been targeted with cuts because of its climate science, but it also sweeps in massive cuts to our weather service operations, and all research on these planetary systems that Kyla was describing. So NOAA is sort of the eyes and ears on the planet. It takes the planet's temperature, whether that's in the ocean or how much gas is going into the atmosphere. She talked about that incredible laboratory at the top of this giant mountain in Hawaii, where NOAA has had a lab collecting data for years and years and years. And the importance of the collection of that data in the same way over and over and over again, I can't state how important that is. I can't overstate how important that is. And coastal communities, people who live near large forests that are dry, people who live near rivers, there are all kinds of people, farmers, weather dependence or weather information needs are tremendous in a country as big as ours, with weather that is as complex as ours. And so there are lots of people all around the country, but particularly coastal communities are at tremendous risk. And those communities that are in the midst of a drought are at terrible risk because of the cuts. And I'll keep explaining that. Next slide, please. So these attacks really are about the president's politics. He claims that the people he's cutting are either poor performers or Marxists, but that's not at all the case. NOAA has always been an agency grounded in science, and it's always punched above its weight. NOAA has always had a shortage of personnel, particularly in the Weather Service. And before these cuts took effect, the Weather Service was already running at a tremendous shortfall because it's hard to find people who are willing to do this work and who are qualified to do this work. And the truth is, the weather forecasts don't differ because you're a red state or a blue state. The Weather Service puts out forecasts in every state. In many, many communities, there are Weather Service offices situated in that community. These people are part of the community. They're not bureaucrats sitting in Washington. They are living in the places where they do work, and they know their customers. And as Kyla said, these are services and they're important to people, but they're hard to replace in the private sector. We would never have created this kind of weather enterprise if it had been just up to the private sector. And sadly, what we're seeing is a lack of trust that's growing in these government services, which is really awful. After the hurricanes hit last fall, there were people on the right wing of the Republican Party who were shamelessly spreading disinformation about accusing the government of actually pushing the weather into certain communities in our country, as if we could modify the weather. Yes, people are studying to see if there are ways that we could impact the weather and maybe make it less harmful, but no one is trying to push weather into vulnerable communities, severe weather. And we certainly can't live without some of these very brave and very selfless individuals who do things like fly airplanes into hurricanes. And I recommend that you take a minute, if you haven't done it, and look for the videos of the Hurricane Hunter airplanes that NOAA flies. These are already at risk because of the cuts. And we are heading into the most precarious, dangerous season of the year. We're heading into hurricane season, and we will be less able to deal with the really challenging storms that we are facing increasingly because of climate change. And it is interesting that they have demonized climate change. It's a fact. It's not something that we can change. And I think Kyla did a great thing, a great presentation on this. It is something we can change if we stop polluting, but the fact that we don't tell people about it doesn't make it any less real. It's not something that if we don't know, it won't happen. It is happening. And what is happening with the Trump administration and Doge in particular is that we are now driving over a cliff backwards with a blindfold on. It won't make the drop. It won't make the harm any less challenging. All it will do is give us less ability to see into the future. And if people think, oh, climate change, it's all hype, it's not happening to me, let me just say, if you've heard the words polar vortex or atmospheric rivers or heat domes, then you're hearing about climate impacts on weather patterns. These are extreme weather patterns that then force these really challenging, difficult, life-threatening and property destroying events that we see all the time. Next slide, please. So I believe that NOAA is one of the target agencies that's being hardest hit in a lot of ways because of an event that happened during the first Trump administration, where the president did something that no other president had ever done. He altered a weather forecast. No president has ever done anything like this to change the forecast of a hurricane, to try to persuade people that it was going in a particular direction. It wasn't even clear exactly why he did it, other than that he was potentially acting on outdated information. But he was extremely embarrassed because a local weather forecaster, not even knowing that it was the president who had altered the forecast, was responding to people in the new zone that the president extended with that black magic marker. This weather forecaster was responding to people in those communities saying, no, we are not in harm's way. And that's important because it's really valuable not to have to prepare if you're not in harm's way. And likewise, it's really valuable to get those storm forecasts exactly right. And that's what NOAA has been doing over time. They are getting better and better and better at this, except now all of that is at risk. And right now, the person who's set to run NOAA is the same person who was in charge of NOAA when this very incident happened, who kind of swept it under the rug and pushed scientists to the side, and I think really did grave damage to scientific integrity within NOAA. And we in the Biden administration tried very hard to restore that integrity. But again, what we did is just a drop in the bucket now, because they have so undermined science. Next slide, please. Is someone going to advance? There we go. So climate change is really important for kind of, or what we need to do now, and what NOAA has been doing over the last few years, is spending more money to try and get those forecasts better. And then we need to communicate about these issues, because climate change is impacting more people than you think. And, I'll take a minute here and say, if you're a person out there in the country, you may not know someone who's been harmed by a Venezuelan gang member or an alleged Venezuelan gang member, but you probably know somebody who's been harmed directly by these extreme weather events. And you probably yourself have been impacted indirectly, because when climate change happens, prices go up for basic goods like eggs, like wheat, like coffee, things that we depend on every single day. Our insurance rates are climbing all over the country because we've had an increasing number of billion-dollar weather disasters in the US over time. And I can tell you, when I started in NOAA, we started to count them. We thought, well, we should be counting these. There's more than a few. There's more than you can count on one hand. And since then, the number has dramatically increased. So the amount of or the impacts of climate are being felt by everyone, even though most Americans believe, even if they believe in climate change, believe it's happening to others. Next slide, please. So what's at risk? The science that NOAA does is tremendously at risk, and the cuts are such that even if these funds were to be restored, we probably couldn't get back what we're losing, which is the routine collection of data. every day, the NOAA Weather Service was putting up weather balloons. Our satellites that were government owned were collecting information the same way and putting it into its models to make our climate forecasts better and better, and cooperating with people all around the world to make sure all of our models kept improving and we were learning from others. But it's a lean agency, and these cuts, because they involve a person here or a person there, are impacting our ability to collect the data, to put it into places where it can be analyzed, and then to make it available to the public. And that is a tremendous loss, because a lot of what happens is beyond the Weather Service. It happens in universities or with the add-on services provided by private weather services or television stations and local meteorologists. NOAA is a lean agency, as I started with. It is an agency that is run incredibly efficiently, and the Weather Service alone costs taxpayers pennies a year, and NOAA altogether is a few dollars a year per taxpayer. It's well worth the money. And I just wanted to reference here that it's more than just weather. It has to do with our food security, things like salmon harvests that NOAA monitors these fisheries, and that allows for commercial catches to happen. And that industry is dependent upon a handful of NOAA employees who are being cut. Next slide. So most people think, oh, well, if we lose NOAA, we'll just use private weather apps. But what they don't appreciate is that every single private weather app, whether it's the one on your phone, every single meteorologist in your community making a television broadcast, every single one of them is dependent upon the NOAA forecasts. And these NOAA forecasts, particularly for extreme weather events that are global in their scope, are only forecast by NOAA. The private weather services often add or create more bespoke or tailored forecasts for particular industries. But when it comes to extreme weather, the only people who are willing to take the risk for providing that kind of warning and watch and doing things like flying into the hurricanes with, in airplanes to take those readings that make us able to exactly predict where the hurricane will come, those things are only possible because of NOAA. And I want to emphasize one further point. When you talk to people about climate change or you talk about these extreme weather events, we often use the term natural disasters, and they are not natural. These are human supercharged events. Yes, we've always had some of these things, but we haven't had the kind of persistent, really extreme weather patterns and weather disasters that we're seeing now. So they are not natural, and the media often portrays them that way, but this is all related to climate change. Next slide. So when the Weather Service is hollowed out in one place, like with these cuts, for people who want to volunteer to leave the government before they're cut, that hollows out the Weather Service in one place. But you can't create a forecast with just local data. These are fronts that move across the world. And so we need the collection of information about how the front is behaving. And we rely on all this information across the country. And when you hollow out one place or a bunch of little places around the country where you don't take those data readings 3 times a day at the exact same time from the same locations, your forecasts get less accurate, and everyone will be worse off because of that. Next slide, please. That's the end. So I just want to emphasize again the importance of NOAA, even though it's a little known agency, to every American in their day-to-day lives. And I take my hat off to the incredible service being provided even in these very difficult times when NOAA's been hollowed out. They continue to deliver every day.
Monica, we had a number of questions, and we can save some of these for the open discussion, but
Sure.
And some of these we may not actually know, some of the questions people are asking. So if we don't know them, we'll try and get back to you. But I had a question. Have you heard anything about the fate of NOAA's new air pollution monitoring satellite or its polar orbiting satellites?
Well, I worry that they will not be, they're up in space, and it is a hugely important program. And one, I will tell this story because it is a reminder that sometimes when you try to do things more efficiently, it doesn't necessarily work out very well. In the Clinton administration, and I was the NOAA General Counsel then, we were part of a program that Vice President Gore put in place to combine weather forecasting, DoD, NASA, and NOAA, and climate forecasting, to put all of that together so that the satellites, we didn't each have our own different program competing. And it turned out that it was very difficult to get the satellites purchased if you were NOAA and you had a budget that was a fraction of NASA's and a decimal point at DoD's. And we had to work extremely hard to get those polar orbiting satellites back online and back in the air. And they did. They worked so hard during the Obama administration, and they are paying off hugely. But if we don't have people to take the data, interpret the data, I think that the satellites will fly, but who runs them, whether they get sold to a private enterprise, and then whether the public gets the benefit of all that data is highly is literally up in the air.
All right. Thank you, Monica. We'll move on to David now.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for attending today and engaging in this such critical conversation that we're having, and very much appreciate Pierre setting this up and inviting me and Monica and Kyla. It's great to follow them. They've really set the stage for what's on the line right now, and the crisis that we are facing, the climate crisis that we know we're facing, that is decades in the making, that we know that we have not done enough to address in the prior decades. And now even the advances that we've made are under grave threat right now. But there's a really interesting, scary connection between the crisis of democracy, the crisis of our rule of law, the crisis of our constitutional structures that we have that intersect with the environmental and climate crisis that we're facing now. And boy, I know it must be difficult. If you're here listening to this, you're steeped in this kind of stuff, and maybe it just makes sense to kind of take a breath, take a moment as we kind of dive deeper and deeper into these kinds of questions. So if I could have the next slide, that'd be great. So, Kyla made some really solid points about what we haven't done and what the Biden administration did not do in terms of advancing climate policy, addressing the climate crisis from an emissions perspective, but also the efforts to seize the opportunities of a clean energy future. And sure, there's always much more that can be done. But I would also submit one of the reasons I was so excited to join the Biden administration was that I saw a leaning forward and a progressive and aggressiveness of addressing this issue and seizing the opportunities that I, in my 30 years of working at the state level, but collaborating with EPA and other federal agencies, had never seen before. The scope and scale was remarkable. And all you have to remember, too, on the constraints that the Biden administration had was the efforts by Senator Manchin to limit the Inflation Reduction Act and other efforts that we made. So, prior to this past January, two major efforts by the Biden administration brought us, like I said, leaps and bounds toward addressing climate, toward meeting our Paris Agreement commitments, to moving the private sector in a direction that would solidify and concretize the efforts to move forward on deployment of all manner of clean energy, and to address environmental justice in a way that had never been done before with the seriousness. And there were two basic components of this, at least at EPA. One was the incentives, the funding that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. At least through EPA, it was greater than $110 billion. Nationwide, it was probably on the order of about $1 trillion, especially if you take into account some predictions of what the tax benefits would lead us to. But this was something that was somewhat new to EPA. EPA is primarily a regulatory agency, and here we were getting the funding on a scale that like a Department of Energy gets. And that was to deploy electric school buses, solar, wind, geothermal, energy efficiency, weatherization, heat pumps, batteries, EVs charging infrastructure. And it was sort of all along the U.S. The U.S. supply chain, understanding that we wanted manufacturing, wanted battery manufacturing, we wanted innovation, and we wanted deployment, and especially deployment in underserved and overburdened communities. And that's what Justice 40 was all about. That was an executive order that required all federal funding, or most federal funding in this regard, that 40% or more would have to go to communities who are underserved, overburdened, who had a legacy of structural racism, righting past wrongs. And one of these particular big chunks, which I'll have some time to talk about, was the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or the Green Banks. $20 billion of that $110 billion was going to that. So that was all on the incentive side. On the regulatory side, I don't know how many regs. I know that I was involved in many on water and air, on climate, but huge regulatory advances on power plants and manufacturing, on vehicles, on methane leaks, on all, on lead pipes, et cetera. And those are the ones that, by the way, shift back and forth between administrations. And when I go to the next slide, please, you'll see this distinction that I make, that and Kyla really put a fine point on the lawlessness that's going on. Some of the actions are actually lawful. I would actually say a small minority at this point, but many of the other actions are likely unlawful, or actually unlawful, unconstitutional, abuse of power, and the two colors of asterisks show those. And let me just walk through some of these. So, for example, there's the announcement of the rollback of 31 regulations. That has a star next to it that indicates lawful. Every administration comes in and changes its regulations. We did. When Biden came in, dozens and dozens of regulations were upgraded, made more protective of human health and the environment. And if EPA follows the administrative law the way that it should, this would be a lawful rollback. I don't agree with it. It's bad, but it's not illegal. Now, their actions have made me wonder whether they in fact will follow administrative law. And I would put, a red asterisk right there as soon as we start seeing some of those actions. And one of those actions related to regulations is the email waiver. You might have seen news on, which there's an obscure part of the Clean Air Act under very unique circumstances. You can provide a waiver for a manufacturing facility that it can avoid some of the constraints of a regulation. But it's a one-off. It happens, I think the last time it happened was in the 2010s or something like that. But essentially what they've said is you can write an email to the president explaining why you want a waiver, paragraph or two, and then the president can decide whether you get a waiver. And in fact, whole industries have now, instead of facility by facility, have stepped up. So the Chemical Industry Association has wanted to do a bulk waiver in this regard. Probably unlawful. We've had the conversation earlier, Kyla has and Monica has, from the NOAA side of staffing reductions. Now, at this point, it seems like all of those have been unlawful. They've violated contracts. They have not followed the appropriate hiring laws that guide, for example, how probationary those staff who have been less than a year can be treated. But there are some of those that are, they're about to come out with a RIF. And if that RIF, this is a reduction in force, if that RIF is driven by budget decisions that are made by Congress, then staffing reductions related to congressional budgets signed by the president are legal. Bad, incredibly damaging, will lead to increased asthma cases and cancer and heart disease, sure. But there may be a legal aspect of that, has to be fought as well. The targeting of the environmental justice programs and those grants, also part of that is lawful. EPA has the authority to change its structure. And in fact, we did in the Biden administration. We created the environmental justice programs. They were the first new division to be created since, I think, Superfund in the 1980s or 90s. Now, it has to follow some legal constraints in building those programs or taking apart those programs. So that's why there's a red star there, too, because there's a lot of actions that have been taken that the courts have responded to and have required cease and desist orders, et cetera. So again, there's like a combination of these, again, overwhelmingly in this case on the unlawful side. The whole freezing and terminating of funds, again, something that the courts have weighed in on that seems to be a blatant abuse of power, a blatant unlawful activity that flies in the face of the balance of power between Congress and the executive. And we happen to be at a moment where Congress is also Republican. It's not stepping up to protect its authority in these kinds of cases. And we've seen the courts act here as well, where freezes have been stopped, and yet it's been very, very difficult to figure out actually how that's happening. There's been such a lack of transparency, and it's very clear that while the courts have attempted to unfreeze some of these funds, the administration is continuing to freeze them and make it very difficult for those organizations, whether they be states or cities or community-based organizations that have followed the law and applied for resources and got those resources and signed contracts, all of whom now are legally should be able to access those funds and do the projects that Congress voted on for them to be allowed to do. It's clear that they are unlawfully being blocked from doing that. And this is whether they've been temporarily frozen or actually terminated. And EPA has announced the termination of 400 plus grants. Now, the Green Bank cancellation strategy is probably the most frightening in the abuse of power and the efforts that the administration is taking, not just to take these efforts to freeze funds and terminate contracts unlawfully, responding with almost no evidence. No, I would say no evidence. And in fact, that's what the courts have said. The courts have been pretty active on this, requiring first evidence to show waste, fraud, and abuse that the administrator had mentioned in a 2-minute online video, none of which has been shown, none of which there's been no due process. And for, by the way, all of these kind of granting activities, there's due process. There's a process by which, if there's actual waste, fraud, and abuse, the funds can be stopped. None of that has been shown. And perhaps the step that's even more frightening, not inconsistent with what's happening in immigration, for example, is use of criminal investigations, both to intimidate and to strike fear in the hearts of the organizations that earned the funding, but also to actual EPA employees who were on the ground working on the development of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. That's the Green Bank Fund, which is, I was one of those. I was on a steering committee, an EPA-wide steering committee. As far as I know, I have not been, at this moment, I'm not being investigated, but it could be a possibility. And that's just the kind of activities that we're seeing throughout this administration across many different areas. This abuse of power, the unlawfulness, the unconstitutional activities that just makes the future of addressing all these kinds of concerns. And again, this is a webinar on our environment. I imagine there are very similar ones going on vaccines, or going on housing, or going on security and immigration, all of those kinds of things, where this is across the board. Why? Which requires, and we'll get to this part of the conversation, why concerted action against what's happening now, particularly on the law, on the lawfulness side, is so critically important. So why don't I stop there? And I know that we're going to move on to Q&A.
All right, thanks so much, David, and to all of our speakers. So we're going to move into a panel discussion and then segue into the Q&A. So we can take the slides down, and if all the speakers could turn your cameras on, please. All right, so during our panel discussion today, we wanted to talk about what actions our viewers can take. We have a lot of concerned citizens that are on the webinar, and they want to know, what we can do to support climate action and federal workers and programs during this time. And I just wanted to start off by reading a few of the audience questions, because I think there was some common themes in people really wanting to know, like, how do we communicate to people that we know and to people that may not have the same education and resources that we have? So I'll just go ahead and read a few of those. So Patricia asked, I struggle to explain what is happening to my friends who are largely disconnected from global and political issues, being busy treading water and unsure how to discern the truth. We need some very simple language to present to these folks. Any ideas? So that's one. Then June also asked, how do we effectively fight the administrations and those who are uneducated to the environmental destruction, who are gullible and potentially easily manipulated? We need to, show them how they're being personally affected to change their view. And then finally, Beverly also asked something similar. So in terms of communications, so pro-life was an issue that helped polarize voters, and many went to Trump accordingly. I haven't heard that phrase associated with climate and environmental crisis, but shouldn't it be? Also, immigrants are on the move in part because of serious environmental degradation. Can't this be pointed out when discussing immigration at the borders? So some themes there, and some food for thought as the panelists take turns answering the question about what actions our viewers can take. So Kyla, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to start. And those are some great questions. And I've always thought that as a group of people, scientists are really not good at public relations and at getting our points across. Somebody mentioned in I think in the chat about Bill Nye, the science guy, and you're right, we need that type of outreach to people. But clearly federal employees, especially NOAA and EPA, they need our help. And what can you do? You can engage, you can talk to people, talk to your friends, talk on social media, try to educate people, and also resist. I know on this talk today, we have one of the organizers of the April 5th protests. I attended in Boston. They were wonderful. Not only is it good to make the media pay attention, all over the world, they paid attention, but it feels good. It uplifts you a little bit to be with like-minded people and to see all the people who are as concerned as you are. But I think most importantly, you should walk the talk. I mean, when I was talking about ecological overreach, we consume too much stuff. I got rid of Amazon. I don't buy plastic crap. I've gotten rid of plastic. I do everything I can to buy secondhand. I'm vegan. My dogs are vegan. My husband's vegan. Eating meat and dairy is one of the worst things you can do for climate change. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, but just think about it. At least try to decrease your meat intake, dairy, fish, things like that. But just to leave you with one thought, because it is overwhelming, we can do this. Dr. Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Failure is not an option. Talk to people, resist, act, vote, do everything you can, and please walk the talk yourselves.
I'll jump in and say something that I think Kyla said in her presentation, but I want to foot stomp it, as we used to say in the federal government. I want to really emphasize it, which is that climate change and in this environmental overreach that she described so well is the hole in every other bucket of problems, whether it's our health. Global pandemics are caused by zoonotic spillover. That's because we're putting too much pressure on the wild world, and people are eating wild animals because they don't have enough food to eat, and that spreads these crazy diseases. Or mosquitoes are everywhere because climate change is impacting weather patterns and making them spreading them to places in the world that they never used to be. Whether it's farming and our food supply, we can't make the food that we need if we're trying to do it in the wrong places at the wrong times with the wrong seeds and not enough water. So everything that people are feeling frustrated about is connected to the crisis that we're causing in our planet. So what can they do? Vote for candidates who can serve the environment. What we have done by putting President Trump in power again is set ourselves 180 degrees in the wrong direction. So we were already in a car that was wobbling because of climate change and these stresses on the environment. And now we're going to go backwards. And again, we're putting a blindfold on so we don't even know where we're going and when we're going to hit the cliff. That's not helpful. And I think the reason people believed what he said was because they really wanted us to have done more faster in a lot of ways. They wanted us to address these issues and to connect the dots for them. And I think we tried hard in the Biden administration, and we did more than any prior administration had ever done, but we didn't do it in a lawless way. And as a result, now what we're seeing is the dismantlement of things that took years to put together in a matter of days and weeks. And we can't put them back together very easily, but we can try if we start to elect the right candidates who care about these issues and who understand that our day-to-day lives are impacted by them, and explain that to voters.
Yeah, I'll mirror a lot of what has been said, and also put a couple of different angles. And I agree, Kyla. Of course, our personal actions are important, and long list of things that you mentioned is something I and people I know do. But this is a structural issue. This is a systemic issue, and the reason that we have choices about what kind of cars, or people choose a choice about what kind of cars or food, is because the system has not set it up in such a way that the decisions that we make are aligned with public health and protection of the earth. And so that's the primary thing that we should all be focusing on. And there are a couple of things that I've thought about in the last couple of months as I've been struggling about where to put my energies. Being a former employee, I left on the inauguration day, having been a Biden appointee. One has been the importance of telling stories about how the actions that are being taken now in Washington impact everyday people's lives. It's learning about the stories and telling them over and over and over again in local media, in social media, etc. And these are ones that obviously transcend blue states and red states. These are the school that was about to get their lead pipes taken out and replaced with healthy lead pipes, but the grant was frozen. This is about a housing unit in a red state that was about to get solar to reduce its energy cost and have local jobs. That was canceled. This is about a municipal bus fleet that was about to get rid of all of its stinky diesel buses and change them to electric buses that would reduce asthma, so parents could stand on the street corner with their kids and not worry about going to the hospital with their kids. It's about jobs that were set to go, electricians who are about to put in EV charging systems. Their grants were canceled. They're out of a job. Those are the stories day to day to day that happen all over this country that have to be driven into the hearts and minds of the media and all over the place. And by the way, I recall early on when a whole bunch of rangers in the National Park Service were fired, and there were these amazing stories that were told by some of the rangers about how they had saved this person who was drowning in the river in the national park he was in, and did water monitoring to make sure the water that was going into the river where people were swimming were safe. All this kind of stuff that impacts what everyday people feel critically important. I hate to say it, everyday people are not so concerned about the climate crisis. They're concerned about asthma that their kids had, which of course highly correlated, right? So, and they're not going to get an electric vehicle because it's going to save the planet. They're going to get an electric vehicle because it's cheaper to maintain, to fuel, fun to drive, all of these kinds of things. And that's kind of one way we have to push it. The other way, and this is a little bit more complicated and a little bit flies in the face, is like to understand what's driving this. So there's no question in my mind, when you read especially those original executive orders on the so-called energy emergency, this is so supportive of the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry, which is on its way out, must be on its way out. We all know it's on its way out. And this is an effort by the Trump administration to repay the support the fossil industry has given him. There's no other explanation why wind and solar would not be included in the energy sources that could provide us energy security. Those are the two fastest growing energy sources in the country. If we're serious about addressing energy security, we'd be dumping tons of funds into it, but we're not, because it's an existential threat to fossil fuels. And that story should be told, because usually United States people don't like when oligarchs, when huge corporations are driving their day-to-day choices. And that's what's happening here. So I think it's very important to tell those stories and then wrap that into the kind of protests that we've been talking about, on the street, protesting what's happening with the government. And I think, yes, I've noticed in some of the chats, people are concerned about retribution. Fair concerned. We're in a different place in this country than I thought we'd ever be. And yet it's also going to take courage for us to stand out and have our voices heard, right? I'm looking at the law firms that have finally stood up. Harvard and Princeton and Wesleyan finally stood up to the demands, the illegal demands of the Trump administration. And those inspire people. And those are the roles that we have to play.
Mur, can I just add one thing that David reminded me of? I agree with everything both of you said, but the one thing that wasn't mentioned is Citizens United. That we have to get money out of politics, because that's the problem. Our politicians on both sides of the aisle are bought and paid for and are doing favors for. So that is something that really has to happen. But education is so key here. If you guys remember in the waning days of the Biden administration, when everybody was freaked out about all the drones in the skies, and a Republican rep posted a picture on Twitter that showed Orion's belt. It was a star constellation. And he said, look at these drones. People are so disconnected from nature. So many of my neighbors go from heat to air conditioning. They never open their windows. They never go outside and look up. Educate people. Go take your kids into the woods, take adults into the woods, learn about nature, because when you're disconnected, when you're living in this virtual reality of screens and games and computers and phones, and you never go outside, you never open your window, you never look up into that night sky, you don't feel like it affects you. But we are part of the web of life. Humans are but animals, and we will go the same way that other animals are going. So education is so key here, and I can't stress that enough.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. That was inspiring, and I think that we all are going to leave here with some actions that we can take and more education that we can bring to our friends and communities. And we do have some time now to take Q&As. And so, Tim, do you want to start with some questions for our panel?
Yes, just for the people on this webinar, we're going to stay till about 5:15. So I know a lot of people will start leaving around 5, so please stay if you have questions. David, we had a few questions asking for more specificity on your presentation. So a couple questions. What is the Green Bank and why does it matter? And what are some of the grants specifically? I think you alluded to them that were canceled.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So the idea of a green bank is a federal institution that has a lot. No, that's not true. Let me take a step back. It's funding that cities, towns, communities, the private sector can go to get a low interest loan, for example, that otherwise they couldn't go to because the private sector financing doesn't want to invest because it's a little too high risk in some of these kinds of proposals. So it's a way to bring financing to projects. And these could be everything, as I mentioned, a school district that wants to get solar on the roof, a company that wants to get all of its fleet converted from fossil fuel cars to electric cars. Imagine a group of hospitals. I live in Boston. You know, we have huge hospital systems. If a hospital system wants to retrofit all of their hospitals with new HVAC systems, high energy efficiency heat pumps, that kind of stuff to save money, so they could put their resources into curing diseases and taking care of patients. That's where we want money to go to instead of expensive energy, electricity. They could go to this bank and say, hey, we need $100 million. We'll pay it back in 5 years. And by that bank giving them that money, then the hospital or any of these examples I've given can go to the private sector lender and say, hey, I've reduced the risk. I've got $100 million from the Green Bank here. Will you pony up some money too? And they'd be more likely to do that. And you can imagine this with a company that wants to develop a new battery, a new solar panel, a new energy efficient car, all of these kinds of things. So the Green Bank would act as this engine of investment in clean technology. And the analysis was that $20 billion would bring 7 times the amount of private sector investment. So turn it into $150 billion. By the way, this kind of thinking was a very bipartisan thinking, and it might even been originally from Republican lawmakers who came up with the idea of these kinds of mechanisms, because they don't love just giving federal dollars out as grants. They'd much prefer it go as an engine of economic investment in the private sector itself. So again, if you think about how the Trump administration is targeting efforts, this was a very powerful one, a very powerful effort that was going to go a very long way to reducing emissions, therefore an existential threat to the fossil fuel industry. So that's one example. I can't go through the long list of the 400 grants, but again, use your imagination of what a city, town, state would want to be investing in that doesn't have its own base to make funding for. So think about, 5 New England states got $432 billion to get heat pumps all over New England, right? They weren't going to be able to do that without. Each of them are going to be ponying up some funding. So that's one of the grants that's on the chopping block. And then you can go all the way down to the smallest scale, $50,000 for an environmental justice community that wants to make sure that its community members can get off of fossil fuel furnaces and get to clean heat pumps. So it runs the whole gamut.
Great. And Monica, I have one question, and then I'll see if Mur has any questions. AI. So this is the era of AI. It has began much more quickly than we ever thought. Most people don't know what it is. I've certainly heard a lot that it will make government more efficient. It can do a lot of the work that employees in government are currently doing. What's been your experience with AI and NOAA, both when you were there, and what you think might work well in the future, and where do you think we're likely to get some problems?
Well, I thank you for the question, and I alluded to it on one of my slides, and I forgot to mention it in my talk. So AI originated, one of the original uses of AI, or the internet of data, use of data to make things better, was our weather forecast, because the data that we have collected, the data that is now potentially interrupted, the data collection that is interrupted, is the very thing that we then channel into determining what is the forecast going to be. And AI can definitely improve that, and it can do it in a faster way. We used to have to buy a lot of supercomputer time, and it was very expensive. And now we can sort of do everything that we did before even more quickly and less expensively. The problem is you have to have the data. Nothing you can do with AI will replace what we in the government are doing today, which is collecting that data and making it publicly available so other people can use their AI experiments and use AI in their ways to try to make that data something valuable. And so AI, it has tremendous potential, but only if we continue as a society to collect the data. And the problem with privatizing the Weather Service is no one has an incentive to share it for free and to do it as comprehensively as we do in the government. It's a uniquely governmental function, and Kayla alluded to these things that you just can't get companies to do in the same way in the public's interest. And that's what we'll lose. And I worry so much about that because no one's forecast will be better. Even the people who have the best AI tools will not have good forecasts without the basic provision of data and collection of data that NOAA provides.
Thank you, Monica.
Thanks, Monica. So a couple of questions that came up towards the beginning related to other forms of overreach and consumption. So I'll read a couple for you, Kyla, and you can see what you think about these. So Sylvia asked, I'd say the problem is population. Granted, the US and China's population growth is going down. India, the most populous country, is growing. The US, China, and Europe are great consumers, and we are to blame. Is population control / education any part of the solution? So that's a question about population. And then Emily also asked, it's not just fossil fuels, but a problem of runaway consumption, reckless, needless consumerism. What are you doing to change the focus towards meeting human needs sanely? And turning away from indiscriminate profit?
Great questions, and I agree. Population is definitely part of the problem. Obviously, the more people we have, the more things we consume, whether it's rare metals or fossil fuels or just stuff. And as far as, people get really touchy about the population issue. I know I have 2 adult children, and both of them are saying they're probably not going to have children because of how the world looks, what the future looks like. I think part of that is getting taken care of because all the chemicals that we're putting into the environment is lowering fertility. But that's kind of, unfortunately, I think that's a third rail. When you start talking about population growth, people really turn off. But I agree, it's part of the problem. It's easier to address the consumerism issue. But, again, we are basically run by corporations who are constantly pushing stuff down our throat. I read an article the other day about how Amazon creates this sense of urgency of, you have to buy this within the next number of hours to get free shipping or to get this price, or, we are bombarded with ads, and you have to buy this to be happy and you have to do that. I think with the tariffs and what's going on and the cost of things, I think that also will come down, not for the right reasons. But I absolutely think that we need to educate people about their consumerism and how it's driving us to extinction.
Thank you.
Can I just jump in and say one thing? It's not exactly in response, but I think it is hard. It is overwhelming. And Kyla talked about her kids, and I have a grandson sleeping in the next room right behind me. And I think about him all the time. And every generation faces challenges, and the environment is always something we have to take care of. And so I do feel like if we are not pushing for things to be better, we are defeating ourselves. But that's the same challenge every generation has faced, and we just have to step up. I do a podcast. It's called Scientista. It's great. I recommend it. We had Gina McCarthy on, who was the climate advisor in the Biden administration and former EPA administrator in the Obama administration, and she said, "People, we just gotta buck up. We've just got to take on this fight, whether it's fighting a government that's working against these issues, or whether it's just doing the work of taking on the issues. It's our duty as citizens today to pass on a planet to our kids and grandkids that they can live in. And, we can't control all of some of these things that are bigger than us, like population trends. All we can do is get up every day and try and make it better."
Dave, before we wrap up, any parting words?
We're at this just time that none of us have dealt with, unless you have lived in another country that has been sliding toward autocracy in the way that we are, right? And I think it's incredibly important, as many folks have said, to stay united in pushing toward the fundamental processes of our democracy. Yeah, those of us on this call are concerned about climate and environment, as we all should be, et cetera. But these fundamental issues of governance in our country that are being questioned right now, if we continue down this path, we're not going to be able to solve these problems. We're not going to address the problems that have all been raised here. So I think we just have to be united in fighting what's going on right now.
Well, I want
Agreed.
to, yeah, I want to thank everyone that joined us today and those that stayed on the extra 15 minutes. David, thank you very much. Monica and Kyla and Murr. We have a parting slide we can put up. We'll leave it up for about 30 seconds so people can get information. And as you sign off today, again, I want to thank everyone for coming and learning and listening to us. And we're in a very difficult time, but Monica, I really liked what you said. Every day we have to get up and help to make things better. And thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Hang in there.